Intel's Xeon W-3175X got a lot of coverage from us at launch and other reviewers, as well as some chilled overclocking streams that eventually led to our more recent LN2 OC streams. It's gotten barely any coverage from anyone since, as both Intel and AMD have continued to raise core counts on their more consumer-oriented CPUs, and the idea of an unlocked 28-core 56-thread Xeon has become a little less special. Still, 56 threads is a massive number, far more than the 18-core 36-thread 10980XE, and within spitting distance of AMD's new 32-core 64-thread 3970X. We're not going to let the W3175X slip quietly into the night, so it'll go loudly in today's video, where we're looking at how it stacks up to the CPUs that have released in the year since launch. Before that, this video is brought to you by Lian Li's O11 Dynamic XL. The O11 Dynamic XL is a follow-up to the critically acclaimed O11 Dynamic, but it's bigger to support more complex builds. We've done air cooling builds and an elaborate liquid cooling build in the O11 Dynamic XL, and we're confident in recommending the case as one of the best options on the market. Learn more about the Lian Li O11 Dynamic XL at the link in the description below. Today we're revisiting the Intel Xeon W-3175X CPU, which is Intel's 28-core 56-thread solution. And it's a good time to revisit because with Threadripper 3 in the picture now, we have
Brian with BPS Customs. We are coming to you live from the GN studio.
Didn't you leave like a week ago?
Dude, you locked me in the supply room.
Oh.
Yeah, I ran out of snacks. I had to eat thermal paste. Yeah, that exact. Well, I might as well.
Brian came here to sabotage us, which is why I lost my voice the other day. So after I caught whatever he brought down from Maryland, we decided to finish this review. And this is the cooler that we're going to be using for most of this. So the 3175X, as we said in our review, is almost impossibly hard to cool with anything close to reasonable. This is the closest to reasonable you can get because it's only a 360mm CLC, which is fine for an HEDT CPU, except the part where we had to strap NIDEC fans to it, which run at something like 70 dBA at 20 inches or so. So it's damn near deafening, really, and anxiety-inducing if you have to sit in the room and listen to it. But that's what's required to get an overclock to actually hold. So we break some rules here, where for typically these high-end CPUs, anything that's mainstream desktop, we stop at 280 CLCs. Anything that's HEDT, we stop at a 360. This is like, it was Extreme Series when it came out, and a normal 360 doesn't even get it close to what it's supposed to be able to do. So it's kind of a balance between how do you do a reasonably fair review with constraints, but also represent the product. And at the end of the day, the 3175X loses in a lot of tests anyway, so we figured we'd give it the best chance we could, strap the most ridiculous cooler we could to it without going open loop or chilled water, and see how it does against a more reasonably cooled 3970X or 3960X. We sort of mentioned this in our 10900X review, where these comparisons are made more difficult by availability. The 3175X was barely present to begin with, but now, much after its launch, I think it launched around January of 2019, it's on Amazon for around $3,500. It's just a bit higher than it should be, really. And there's a consumer C621 motherboard, which is the chipset for these. We often called it X599 or X499, whatever, but it's really C621. And that board, if you can find one, would sell for about $1,000. So you're at $4,500 CPU plus board, which is insane. The 3960X is about $1,400. To be fair, the new Threadripper stuff is basically non-existent also. Can't really find it in stock. It'll get there, but it'll take another month or so to equalize the stock levels. Either way though, $1,400 for the CPU. Motherboards you can get under $1,000 if you want. 3970X is like $2,000 for the CPU. So no matter what, you could almost build 2 full Threadripper 3 workstations for the cost of one of these Intel 3175X workstations, because Intel's pricing hasn't changed on these. There's also an issue, just availability in general. Some of the motherboards for C621, only 50 of them were made when the processor came out. So good luck getting a board. EVGA is the latest to the party. They just put out their SR3, I think it's called, which is a great board, but it's unfortunate that EVGA is reliant upon another partner for it to actually be relevant. But either way, there's not a lot of volume, and that's one of the problems. Anyway, let's get into our benchmarks. We'll start with production, go into games, and then talk a bit more about if this thing's worth it and when it might be. Our production benchmarks will start with Adobe Premiere rendering, which is the test that's the most relevant to us as a company. Our original test results, back before the new AMD launches, had us wanting to buy a 3175X for use in a rendering machine, as we can't use our test CPU since they have to be reserved for benchmarking. We never did buy one, given the pricing and availability issues, but that turned out to be a good thing. These charts will use different tests than were used in our original review from January, so we can't compare them directly, but we have all new data anyway. As in our original testing, the 3175X clocked some of the fastest render times of any CPU we've tested straight out of the box. It managed to render our 1080p benchmark video in 2.3 minutes, tying it with the overclocked 3970X and just seconds behind the 109080XE overclocked at its impressive 4.9 GHz. Overclocking the 3175X tied it up for the fastest render time on the chart so far, bumping it to 2.2 minutes. Although this gain is only 4.3% render time reduction from stock. AMD's stock performance had it roughly tied with the stock 3175X at 2.4 minutes render time required. The 3960X stock CPU ran at 2.5 minutes, also reasonably close, and allowed the Intel 3175X a lead of only 4% from stock to stock, but the 3960X has a much less upfront cost. A hell of a lot less, and it's more, well, the motherboards at least, are more easily found. Cheaper still, the 3950X finished in 2.8 minutes when stock, allowing the 3175X a 14% time reduction. That's not bad for a $750 part matched up against a bunch of multi-$1,000 parts, or at least $1,400 in the case of the cheapest of these. For the more intensive 4K 60 render, the stock 3175X was already faster than anything else we tested at 5.7 minutes, and it only got faster still when overclocked, with a final render time of 5.1 minutes. The render time reduction after an all-core OC to 4.1 GHz was 10.5%, which is massive when compared to the previous chart, but still not great when compared to the 600 watts plus power consumption. The most relevant comparisons for us are 4K rendering with a stock 3175X versus the 3970X and 3960X when all of them are stock, and the 3175X was about 5 to 7% faster than either of these stock to stock. If the 3175X didn't cost so much, and if the boards weren't so hard to find and so expensive, it might be worth it to buy one for rendering rather than using the 3960X. But given the cost and the availability, it's just really incredibly hard to justify the 3175X, if it can be justified at all. Overclocked, the 3970X runs at 5.9 minutes for the render, allowing the overclocked 3175X a 14% render time reduction. Overclocking has always been where the 3175X has shined. It's an overclockable Xeon. That's the whole point of it. And that remains true here. But cooling is almost impossibly hard, and the accompanying heat dump into the room is similarly challenging. Either way, the 3970X and the 3960X, and to some extent even the lower performing 3950X, are all much easier to justify for this workload, but if you need the best of the best and you're not willing to compromise, you can still do the 3175X. It's just that we're not sure how long it will remain a chart topper, and the overclocking cost in cooling, noise, and thermals is obscene. So that's a really small use case. Blender is next. Our test for open source 3D animation and tile-based rendering uses Blender. Blender is among the most popular studio applications in the world, and it's grown considerably in the last year with the support from Epic Games. Blender scales with core and thread count more than any other test we publish, since each tile spawns for one thread. The GN Monkey Head render is first, using a mix of visual effects that produce a varied load on the CPU. We also have a GN logo ray tracing render that we'll talk about next. Between these two render files, we're able to somewhat isolate frequency benefits and see where some CPUs change rank. With the monkey head render, the 3175X stock CPU completes in 7.6 minutes, which has it between the 18-core 10980XE at 4.9 GHz and the 3960X stock CPU. The 3960X is a 24-core CPU, which runs at a thread deficit to the 3175X, but manages a render time requirement reduction of 9%. Overclocking the 3175X allows it to leap ahead to 6.1 minutes, a massive 20% time reduction from stock. The 3970X stock CPU at 32 cores manages 5.6 minutes though, for a completion time that is 8% faster than the overclocked 3175X. If we were to talk power, and we will later, the 3970X is significantly more efficient at a couple hundred watts versus the upwards, it's somewhat comical, of 600 to 700 watts. The GN logo render is next. The logo render is also primarily responsible for the 4.1 GHz OC limit on our production benchmarks, as trying to render that file with a sufficient voltage to maintain 4.5 GHz was quickly pushing the CPU beyond 110C, even with the massive EK-CLC and alarmingly fast and physically dangerous 70 dBA at 20-inch NIDEC fans that we used for these tests. The 3970X didn't exist when the 3175X launched, but it does now, and there are cheaper ways to speed up CPU renders than a $3,000 Xeon and a literal hurricane in your computer case. The 3175X stock CPU finished in 9.3 minutes, compared to 8.9 on the last gen 32-core Threadripper part. The 3960X completed the benchmarks in 8.1 minutes, illustrating the gains of this Zen generation and allowing a render time reduction of 13% versus the 3175X. Overclocking to 4.1 GHz all-core on the 3175X definitely helped, but the overclocked 3970X still beat it with a 22% time reduction, and also the stock one beat it too. So, not really everything we need. Photoshop is next. This one is in some ways akin to gaming workloads in that it doesn't make great use of high core counts. That's doubly bad news for the 3175X, since we had to dial back the overclock from our gaming clocks for all of these production tests. The overall stock 3175X CPU was at 1021 points in the performance range of AMD's much cheaper 3700X and 3800X R7 CPUs. This is not an application that requires a workstation CPU, as illustrated by the 9900K holding first place on the charts. The overclocked 5.2 GHz 9900K leads the chart with an overall score 12% higher than the stock 3175X, and overclocking the 3175X barely raised its performance. The Threadripper 3970X scored 1088 points here, just a little better than the Xeon, but a respectable difference given the lightly threaded game benchmark results that we'll cover in a moment. Either way though, you shouldn't really be buying either of these CPUs if Photoshop is the only thing you do or the primary thing you do. You should be looking at something more like a 9900K that's more frequency advantaged. 7-zip is next for benchmarks, looking at compression and decompression measured in millions of instructions per second. The Intel Xeon W-3175X sets a new record in compression with an impressive score of 166,000 MIPS. The previous leader was the overclocked 3970X at 149,000 MIPS, but the stock 3175X beat that by 11.2%, and when it was overclocked too, it widened that gap to almost 21%. This particular test doesn't seem to care too much about frequency, as is evidenced by the small jump from the 10980XE at 116,000 MIPS for stock to 124,000 MIPS for the overclocked result. So we think this comes down to maybe an instruction set that AMD doesn't have, or some architectural difference. As for decompression, AMD still holds a massive lead here with a top score of 377,000 MIPS for the overclocked 3970X, as opposed to 253,000 MIPS for the overclocked 3175X. The gap is an insane lead of 49% for the 3970X, or 51% when stock. The 3960X, for reference, manages a lead at 254,000 MIPS of 8.5%, while being $1,400 instead of $3,000 or so. This is a good reminder that among production workloads, there are some highly specific tasks with some highly specific performance differences between AMD, Intel, and their individual CPUs. We'll be bringing back a compilation test and other such workloads in future CPU benchmarks too. V-Ray is another render benchmark, but much smaller than the Blender test that we do. Core count on the 3970X gives it a lead here again at 20 seconds to render at stock settings versus 24 seconds on the 3175X, and 18.7 seconds versus 20 seconds overclocked versus overclocked. Stock turbo for the 3175X is 3.8 gigahertz, but even bumping that up to just 4.1 gigahertz across 28 cores, which is hard to maintain, mind you, can't make up for the 3970X's core count advantage in some workloads like this one. The 3960X is roughly tied with the 3175X when both are stock, and the 3950X, for reference, runs notably slower than all of these at 36 seconds render time, although still really good comparatively. Moving on to games now, we can start looking at how things perform on the other side of what the CPUs do in our tests. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is first up, a DX12 game that we found tolerates high core counts fairly well, even though it's not the main factor in performance for these CPUs. The W-3175X came out of the gate very strong, with a stock average of 165 FPS and 0.1% lows averaging almost 100 FPS. There's no reason to expect a Xeon to excel at gaming, but it did have good frame time pacing and overall performance, coming fairly close to the performance of the stock 9700K or 9900K. There was just a 3.3% lead for the stock 9900K. In comparison, the 3970X averaged just 143 FPS, stock and overclocked, while the W3175X boasted a few FPS higher than stock to a 169 FPS average when at 4.5 gigahertz. These numbers don't top the chart. They're pretty close for silicon that wasn't really designed with this in mind, but obviously we'd still recommend something else for gaming-focused builds, as this really isn't meant for gaming, neither is Threadripper. The question is only, can they still do it reasonably well without encountering some kind of weird issue? Like sometimes you have scheduling behavioral issues in the OS where having high core counts can actually ruin a gaming experience. So we're just looking for that, and we're not seeing that here from Threadripper or from the 3175X. Hitman 2 is our next of the two DX12 titles after Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and it's similarly friendly towards high core counts. At 1080p, the stock W3175X held 130 FPS average, with the stock 9900K increasing its advantage to 4.5%. The 3970X averaged 123 FPS, and again showed barely any benefit at all from an all-core overclock, since the stock limited core boost on Ryzen 3000 CPUs is almost always higher than a practically achievable all-core overclock. Overclocking the 3175X had much better results, with a 16.7% uplift over stock to 152 FPS average. The 4.5 gigahertz overclock is much more difficult to maintain without an extreme cooling solution though, and wouldn't be feasible without ridiculous open loop cooling with potentially loud fans. Hitman 2 scales performance reasonably at 1440p, although GPU limitations begin to appear at the top of the chart. The W3175X loses almost all of the overclocking performance gains with a 129 FPS OC average versus 125 FPS average stock. The 3970X's performance, meanwhile, is almost unchanged from 1080p with a 121 FPS average, which makes sense when considering that the CPU is bottlenecking the GPU, so of course it wouldn't change. The overclocked 10980XE and 10900X are the only ones that rise head and shoulders above the rest of the scores in this test, with most mid to high-end CPUs averaging in the 110 to 130 FPS range. Again, though, you really shouldn't be buying any of these chips for playing games as a primary use case. It's more of a secondary consideration between workstation tasks. Civilization 6 turn time testing is up now, which looks at how long it takes a processor to simulate an AI player's turn rather than looking at FPS. This is the first title where the stock 3970X has an advantage over the 3175X with a 5.1% reduction in average turn time from 33.1 seconds to 31.4 seconds. As usual, overclocking the 3970X had barely any effect, while the 3175X cut time significantly down to 29.6 seconds. Our experience with this title is that pretty much any CPU with more than 4 cores scales based on frequency, and that continues to be true here. Although frequencies can't be compared, obviously, between AMD and Intel, they can be compared intra-architecture. The fastest average turn times so far here are with the 4.9 gigahertz overclocked at 10980XE, 5 gigahertz 10900X, 5.1 9900K, and so on. The 3175X keeps up pretty well at 4.5 gigahertz, but the difficulty of all-core overclocks only increases with the number of cores. Assassin's Creed is next, starting at 1080p. At 1080p, the 3175X ran Assassin's Creed at 126 FPS average, but fell behind mainstream desktop CPUs like the 3900X at 134 FPS stock or the 9900K at 140 FPS stock. The 3970X also did about 6.6% better than the Intel 3175X here at stock settings, averaging around 134 FPS regardless of OC, while the 3175X leapfrogged it with an OC up to 139 FPS at 4.5 gigahertz. This is measurable, but it's not meaningful or perceptible. There's no difference in how the game feels between these two results. None of our results for this test have gotten much more than 140 FPS average, so that puts it up against the same performance limits as the 9700K and 9900K stock and overclocked. Assassin's Creed at 1440p doesn't change much for the overclocks, although more rank is lost in the stock results as load shifts around to demand more in latency-bound scenarios. The 3175X stock result now runs at 108 FPS average, around the 3800X and 2700X OC results. The 3970X and 3960X sit toward the middle, near the 3900X. Nothing is unplayably bad, we just lose some frame rate. The 3175X does relatively poorly here overall, despite still being playable. It's just obviously not something we'd prefer to buy for only this. F1 at 1080p is our next game. F1 always scores the highest average frame rates of all of our tests, far beyond anything required for playing this game especially, but it still has really good scaling represented between the CPUs, and for that it's useful. The 3175X stock averaged at 299 FPS, with some extremely poor 47 FPS 0.1% lows, a reflection of some scheduling issues on the Intel 28-core CPU that end up showing up in the frame time consistency of playback. The 3970X averaged at 263 FPS, but with moderately better 82 FPS 0.1% lows. Overclocking the 3175X raised its average by 8.8% to 325 FPS, suddenly one of the best results we've had for this game, beating the overclocked 9900K and KS and falling just behind the overclocked 10980XE. We think this has something to do with the mesh overclock, as moving to 30X improves latency, and we know F1 can have some memory dependencies. 1440p for F1 2018 positions the 3175X at 240 FPS average when overclocked, about tied with an i5 9600K stock CPU, and at about 236 average stock, near the 10980XE stock or i5 8400 CPU. This isn't really the right workload for the part, clearly. The 3970X is also not a stellar performer, down in the lower portion of the chart. Its overclock can hurt performance too, as the 3970X with an all-core OC will lose top-end single-core frequencies. GTA 5 is an old standby, but still one of our best titles for keeping things CPU limited all the way to the top of the stack. The W-3175X averaged 110 FPS stock. The 3970X is also not a stellar performer, down in the lower portion of the chart. Its overclock hurt performance too, as the 3970X with an all-core OC will lose top-end single-core frequencies. Overclocking again had a definite impact on the Xeon, raising it to 132 FPS average and bumping up against the top of the chart once again. The 9900KS clocked to 5.2 gigahertz is right above it at 135 FPS. We never see CPUs with core counts this high scoring this well in games, and it's still impressive even after a year to see a Xeon with 56 threads capable of scoring like overclocked desktop parts in an old and lightly threaded gaming benchmark. Most of the performance is definitely coming from the frequency though. The stack for GTA 5 is the same at 1440p, so that performance wasn't a fluke, and we can move on right away. At worst, Total War Warhammer can bug out when running on high core count CPUs, but for the 3175X, it just turned in a relatively lackluster performance of 97 FPS without any stuttering or bad 0.1% lows. The 3970X did a little better at 104 FPS average, but it falls prey to the same problems. The The stock 8-core, 16-thread 9900K averaged 179 FPS here. Clearly the software has an issue, but it's a real-world problem that users may have to deal with. Overclocking the 3175X helped a little and raised its average 5.4% to 102 FPS, but that doesn't compare to the leaps seen in some other benchmarks. Finally, for power numbers, we'll just show Blender to get an idea for performance. This is where the W-3175X starts to look kind of bad, if it didn't already. The 3970X finished its GN logo render in 31% less time, while requiring 24% less power. There's a time reduction for rendering and a power consumption reduction. If you're running a lot of boxes for some sort of localized render farm, you'd save a lot in power with the 3970X instead, especially once you start considering external cooling requirements like AC BTUs or something. The 3175X at the higher power consumption, when forced with extreme cooling like open loop, pushes north of 600 watts, which is starting to get ridiculous, especially considering the efficiency of the alternative chips. Working into the conclusion, compatible motherboards for Threadripper 3000 CPUs are cheaper and more varied. Even though there are currently only 2 CPUs that fit the socket STRX 40 boards, the 3960X and 3970X versus the many Xeons that technically fit LGA 3647, there are just 3 motherboards purpose-built specifically for the overclockable W-3175X. Each competes for a fraction of an audience. EVGA's SR3 again is the newest, but we've got a bad feeling that it might be the second SR board in a row that gets let down by a dearth of overclockable Xeons. The W-3175X was sold in small numbers, more as a headline grabber than anything, and it worked. It was actually a really good CPU when it came out. We wanted it for production machines. If it weren't so expensive, we would have bought one by now. But it's good that we didn't, because it's lost a lot of that hold to the new Threadripper 3 parts, and the pricing hasn't really changed. So we noted in our original review that it was unclear, if ever, when these CPUs and motherboards would be available outside of the small volumes or outside of pre-built systems, which is where they were kind of targeted initially. Those doubts were justified because a year later, there's a decent chance that there's actually more open loop hardware available for these things than the actual product itself. EK is probably sitting on a mountain of these coolers that they can't get rid of. The motherboard vendors, we know one of them at least has about 300 that they're sitting on right now of their board because they committed to a bigger order later and now they're stuck with them. So as for how many of these CPUs sold, AnandTech noted a, quote, low 4-digit number for the 3175X, and that sounds about right. For overclocking, it's fun, but it's a purely enthusiast thing, and now the 3970X is winning in some stuff like TimeSpy anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And even though you can do 4.5 gigahertz on this, with this cooler even, it doesn't hold in anything except for games, so it doesn't really matter a whole lot. And of course, you never need a 28-core CPU for gaming anyway, because you end up worse in a lot of cases, in almost all, if not all cases, than a 9900K. So this isn't our 3175X review. We already wrote that. This is a revisit. And we still can't help caution you to just not buy the CPU. If you have a really specific use case, maybe decompression, then I guess you're a better judge than we are at that point, so you can figure it out. But on average, our choice is to skip the 3175X now. We liked it a lot originally. It wasn't something we could recommend necessarily just because of the price, but there were instances like Adobe Premiere where it made a lot of sense, and those are mostly clawed away. So it's objectively a good CPU, but it is not a competitive CPU. Like the 10900 and the 10980 XE, they're objectively good, they're just not competitive, and that means you shouldn't really be buying them. So that's the revisit of the 3175X. Threadripper really makes it look kind of bad in a lot of instances, except for maybe 1 or 2, and it's not even really our choice for extreme overclocking anymore either, which is not something we expected because Intel's held that realm forever. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab our Disappointment Build t-shirt, which has the 10980XE referenced on it. And you should also check out the Disappointment PC build if you haven't seen that video. Put a lot of work into it. Or go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for behind-the-scenes videos. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.